Welcome everybody to the launch event for the Outputs of Voice of Refugee Research Initiative. My name is Asma Rabi and I'll be your host for the next hour. I'm an Afghan refugee living in Peshawar, Pakistan, and I was one of the refugee researchers who took part in the Refugee Youth Research Initiative. There were a lot of people involved in the development and implementation of Voice of Refugee Youth, many of whom are here on the webinar today. I particularly want to welcome those who were participants in this research, providing their insights over the course of the study and ensuring we have something useful to say today. Thank you all for being here with us. Voice of Refugee was a 4-year longitudinal panel study exploring the impact of post-primary education for refugees. The study focused on Pakistan and Rwanda, where we engaged with roughly 1,200 refugee students across 3 data collection points, with young refugee researchers playing a significant role at each stage. The study was delivered through a partnership of Jigsaw Education, Refugee Education UK, and UNHCR, and was funded by the GERE. Over the course of the 4 years, the research team produced a number of outputs, including a journal article, a participatory research toolkit, 2 advocacy reports, one for Pakistan and one for Rwanda, written by young refugee researchers themselves, a policy brief, flagship research study. All of these reports can be found through the link we will provide at the end of our time together. It is a real joy to have the opportunity to share our findings from the past 4 years with you all. So now moving towards the agenda, we have got a fun-packed hour together where we'll be hearing from a range of people who have been involved in the study, as well as a couple of speakers from the linked organization who will reflect on the findings and help to situate the study within the broader sector discourse. We'll begin with a presentation from the key findings and recommendations from the research study. After this, we'll hear an overview of the methodology and unique elements of the participatory approach utilized throughout the study. Following these 2 presentations, I'll pose some questions to 2 panelists who have kindly agreed to reflect on what has been shared, Serenia Viega from UNHCR and Salim Salama from FCDO. Just before we finish, my colleague David will provide a brief snapshot of what's next with our exciting plans for the future. We will then draw the webinar to a close. So we'll hear from lots of different people in this hour together. There won't be a specific session for additional questions from the wider group. However, we want to have as much interactions as possible. So please use the Q&A function at any point during this hour for any questions that you want to ask or ideas that you want to share. A couple of the study team will be monitoring the Q&A function and will reply to the questions there as we go. To navigate to the Q&A function, you can select the activities button, the 3 shapes in the bottom right corner of the screen, and then select Q&A, which is the 3rd option. My colleagues will respond to the call chat so that everyone can see the questions. Okay, I think that's enough introductions from me. As mentioned just now, we are going to start with a presentation of the findings from the Voice of Refugee Youth research study that my colleagues Catherine and Ame Pafe are going to present to you. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Asma. It's really great to be here, and thanks to everyone for coming. I'm Chief Executive at Refugee Education UK and also a research advisor for Jigsaw Education. And I had the absolute pleasure of being one of the co-leads on this project. And my colleague Aimé Parfait and I are going to spend about the next 15 minutes talking you through some of the key findings that emerged and then some of the recommendations that came from that. The Voices of Refugee Youth project was, as Asma said, a Jigsaw, Refugee Education UK, UNHCR collaboration that really aimed to build the evidence base for refugee education, but to do so using a methodology that positioned young refugees at the centre of the research. So our 2 focus countries were Rwanda and Pakistan. And central to the project was the team of 31 refugee youth researchers across the 2 countries. Our study had 4 key goals that are mutually reinforcing. And really they center around the principle that you should be able to design and carry out research projects in such a way that their very existence contributes to addressing some of the challenges that they are exploring. So for us, recognizing that we are exploring the impact of post-primary education, we wanted to provide opportunity for accredited graduate study for all 31 of the youth researchers. And a special shout out and thanks to John Carroll University in the US for accrediting and hosting those modules in social science research methods that we created. This in turn has helped increase pathways to employment in the research sector. And our hope is that the global network of young refugee researchers that this project has kickstarted will continue to shift the power dynamic in the research sector. So my colleagues Rosina and Becky are going to kind of unpack the methodology a little bit shortly. So I'm not going to dwell on it here in the way that one might usually. But for context, as Emma and I talk through the findings, it is helpful for you to just see this brief overview of the study. Know that we followed a cohort of 1,126 refugee youth, gathering data about the barriers that they faced and what actually worked for them as they transitioned through secondary and higher education. The study has a range of outputs. Asma's already talked about those, so I won't repeat what she has said, but just want to encourage you to dig into those. Today, we're just going to pull out some of the key overarching findings and recommendations. So those of you who love the technical detail, please do explore the other outputs that we have. So, Aimé Parfait, it's over to you for the findings.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm Aimé Parfait, and I'm a Burundian refugee currently based in Rwanda. And throughout this project, I worked as a youth researcher in Rwanda and have been part of the Voice of Refugee Youth team. Our findings are drawn from 7 research questions, but for the sake of this presentation, we've clustered them into 4 key categories. Firstly, the difference that post-primary education makes to young refugees. Secondly, the systemic factors that, despite the difference it makes, still constrain young refugees' ability to get into, thriving, and progress to higher levels in education. Thirdly, how pathways to employment from post-primary education are both navigated and obstructed. And finally, though this is infused throughout the findings, I want to pause specifically on some of the very clearly articulated refugee youth perspectives on the importance of post-primary education that have emerged from this study. Firstly, the impact of post-primary education. So overwhelmingly, we found that post-primary education matters. It made a tangible positive difference for 94% of the cohort in 6 key areas, related not only to education outcomes, but also to young people's ability to contribute to their own and host communities. We also learned not to underestimate the power of higher education, in particular when it comes to boosting the agency of refugee youth. We found those who completed higher education had almost double the reported rate of self-determination of circumstances across the cohorts when compared with those who had only completed secondary school. However, moving on to our second category, despite the clear and tangible positive impacts of post-primary education, there are still significant factors that need to be addressed if young refugees are truly to thrive in and progress to higher levels of education. We found that lack of resources, including technological resources, as well as lack of holistic trauma-informed support within schools, was constraining
I think Emma is facing some connectivity issues. Catherine, can you please follow up on this?
Yeah, sure. No problem. So I think Emma, if if you come back, just start talking, and you can pick up again. I'm really happy to jump in as needed. So the point that Emma was just making as he got cut off was that our finding that a lack of resources, including technological resources, as well as holistic and trauma-informed support within schools, was constraining educational thriving for young people. Emma, it looks like you're back.
Thank you so much.
I will pass back to you. I was just about to make the point about poor teaching quality, so maybe you can pick up from there.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. And so when it comes to progressing to higher education, levels of education, yes, prohibitive fees and administrative hurdles are still stopping young refugees from progressing. And you can see the acute contrast, the very high percentage of young refugees who aspire to go to university at data point 1, and the very low percentage who had actually realized that aspirations by the end of the study. Pathways to employment remains a challenge, with fewer than 30% of total participants in paid employment at data point 3. Nonetheless, there was a positive correlation between university completion and employment, particularly in Rwanda, and learners perceive this level of education to be absolutely essential for secure employment. Despite this, legal barriers to work, employer prejudice, a challenging job market still contribute to unemployment and need to be addressed. Finally, I do want to emphasize that refugee youth consider post-primary education to be essential. Despite the challenges that unfulfilled progression and employment goals many face, the belief that investment in education will pay off in time remains, and participation in education was strongly associated with greater optimism and determination. So in the interim, education was seen as a critical tool for developing oneself and the local communities, and it strikes us as important to remember and value this as we try to improve concrete progression and employment outcomes for young refugees. Now back to Catherine for the recommendation.
Thank you so much, Aimé Parfait. I'm so glad that we only lost you for a few seconds there. I'm going to pick up with reflecting on, in the light of what Aimé Parfait has shared, what then should we do? And for context, there are over 20 specific recommendations across the reports, and we've condensed them into 9 across 3 key areas in our policy brief. And so that is what I am going to share with you today, as it is the most kind of condensed version of the quite substantial and detailed findings that have emerged from the report. So again, I would encourage you to read the full set of technical findings and recommendations in the full flagship and country-specific reports as well. For today, the 3 categories that the recommendations are going to fall into are enhancing quality, enabling progression, and equipping for work. So in order to actually enhance the quality of education that refugees are receiving, what do we need to do? Well, firstly, when it comes to post-primary curricular design, education policymakers should continue their efforts to centralise the transferable skills that this research found made a positive difference for young refugees. That includes things like communication, confidence, critical thinking, and ensure that refugee learners have full and equal access to these components of the curriculum. Secondly, to address the growing tech inequalities that young refugees reported, the International Refugee Education Donor Community should work with host governments to establish and boost inclusion in technology access schemes, specifically tailored to the needs of refugee communities who are amongst the most excluded. Thirdly, If refugee students are really to thrive, then governments and donors need to provide specialist training and associated finance to enable education institutions to provide holistic, trauma-informed support to young refugees. And lastly, in this category, teaching quality, which I think was the finding that we kind of got slightly muffled in the point when we lost MA Parfait, really needs to be addressed. And this requires appropriate remuneration and valuing of refugee teachers. And so governments and donors need to work together to ensure that teachers from a refugee background are paid a salary aligned with that of teachers who are host country nationals, based, of course, on qualifications and experience. In addition to that, regular teacher professional development opportunities for all teachers, both refugee teachers and host country teachers, should be provided on supporting refugee learners. Coming on to our second category around enabling progression to the higher levels of education. Firstly, host governments should really examine what they can do to take steps towards ensuring that refugee students pay the same fees as host community students and have equal access to grants and loans. The wording here is intentional of take steps towards. It would have been quite easy to put a recommendation that host countries should immediately provide equal fees and equal access to grants and loans. What we have found is that a number of governments and a number of donors feel that they can't do that, and so they ignore this whole area completely. And what we're saying is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Don't do nothing because you can't do everything. So if you're not in a position to do that in a blanket policy change, then proactively explore what are the steps that you could take towards that and how can we still make progress to a more equitable system. Secondly, recognizing that that is a longer term piece of work in some contexts. In the interim, the refugee education donor community and universities themselves should continue to expand their provision of targeted funding through scholarships, grants and loans to supplement government provision and ensure parity with national students. And finally, how can we better equip young refugees for work? Well, firstly, education institutions should prioritise the development of practical skills within national curricula to improve refugee readiness for the workplace, and add targeted content within teacher professional development programmes to ensure that this is actually applied in the classroom. Secondly, UNHCR should continue to invest in the development of strategic partnerships with providers of workplace readiness training schemes across the private and public sectors, facilitating industry placements, apprenticeships, and fairly paid internships for refugees. And finally, government ministries should look to explore opportunities for technical and vocational training for refugees to be better aligned with local emerging markets and context-specific employability trends, because it really isn't a case of one size fitting all. As I've said, this has been a whistle-stop tour of our findings and recommendations, and I would again encourage you to dive into all of the research products to get the full technical detail. If you have a particular link to one of the focus countries, then you'll find additional context-specific recommendations there too. So thank you so much for listening, and back to Asma.
Thank you, Catherine and Ami Pafi, for outlining the key findings and recommendation of the study. I can really see the voice of young people that we directly interacted with coming through in all that you have said. Having looked at the findings, we are now going to focus on the groundbreaking methodological approach used in the study that we hope goes on the influence of research practices across the sector more widely. And now I'm going to invite Becky and Rosina to present this. Over to you, Rosina.
Thanks, Asma. Hi, everyone. I'm Rosina. I'm an Afghan refugee based in Pakistan, and I was one of the youth researcher of team in Pakistan, and will be presenting with my colleague Becky from Jigsaw. We'll be taking the next 10 to 15 minutes to reflect on participation in refugee education research using the approach we employed for Voices of Refugee Youth as a basis for further discussion on this topic. So, as a brief introduction to this topic, why is participation research important? Many of you attending this webinar will doubtlessly be familiar with participation as a concept, but it's helpful for us to consider the intended benefits of this research approach. Broadly speaking, participatory research involves key stakeholders in setting priorities and making decisions during the research process, such as helping to define the research questions. There are many recognized benefits, but in short, it has been identified as an approach which can lead to more robust and honest responses in data collection, identify context based research issues, improve the accessibility and usefulness of research findings, and ensure that participants are recognized for their contributors in a more equitable and transparent way. While there are lots of different approaches to participatory research, one area of particular interest to this research study was youth participation. At the 2022 Transforming Education Summit, the Youth Declaration advocated for more meaningful engagement of young people as fully fledged partners in education policy and decision making. This is particularly true of research in context of conflict and forced displacement, where young people's voices are rarely involved as active participants in research. So, for Voices of Refugee Youth, we thought to respond to this call, and we'll reflect on this very shortly. But first, I'm going to hand over to Becky to reflect briefly on how the research team understood participation in this context of the study.
Thanks, Rosina. And just to build briefly on her introduction, I'm Becky. I am a researcher with Jigsaw based in the UK and had the pleasure of working with Rosina, Asma, Amy Parfait, and the rest of our youth researcher teams in Pakistan and Rwanda during this initiative. As Rosina has alluded to, we're very aware that there are many approaches to participation and debates as well around what constitutes meaningful participation. There's lots published on this topic, including some great publications in the last year or so, which align with much of our thinking on this topic, particularly around areas of co-creating knowledge and making meaning together. But in particular, I want to pause for a moment on this framework from the ladder of participation, which we found particularly helpful in reflecting on our definition and practical implementation of participation throughout the Voices of Refugee Youth initiatives. This ladder, which was originally designed for child participation, but which we have adapted for youth-centred research, highlights different levels of participation. So you can see that starts with 3 non-participatory approaches to research, and then moves up through different degrees of participation, from assigning tasks to youth, through consultation and shared decision making, all the way up to youth-initiated research. In general, this study, Voices of Refugee Youth, fell within levels 5 and 6, we would say. Youth researchers' participation sometimes took the form of consultation, but aimed as much as possible to involve shared decision making with the Jigsaw and REUK research team. Although this varied at different stages of the study, this is something we want to reflect on in this presentation. The ways in which, the factors which enabled and hindered us in working our way up this ladder. But just to touch briefly again on the approach that we took during Voices of Refugee Youth. As Kat has mentioned, there were 31 youth researchers, 15 in Pakistan, predominantly Afghan refugees, and 16 in Rwanda, Burundian and Congolese refugees. All of those were involved or recently graduated from university degrees in these 2 countries, recruited in January 2019 before the start of the study, and they engaged in all aspects, all steps of the research study, albeit, as I've mentioned, in different ways at different stages. So we're going to reflect on this in a little more detail now, thinking through the different steps of the study. And we've grouped our reflections in these 4 broad areas. Like Catherine said, there is a lot more detail on this. We have produced a participatory toolkit, which I'd really encourage you to look at in more detail. But for now, I'll pass back to Rosina to reflect on the first of these areas.
Thanks, Becky. So I'll start with reflecting on the first few stages of the research study, that is the project design, recruitment of the youth researchers, and decisions around payment. A key feature of the start of project was scoping phase, which took place with refugee youth at the outset of study to define its focus and feasibility before a full proposal was submitted and funding was secured. Giving time to this consultation was really important to make sure that we, the refugee youth whom the research affects, were engaged in the Voices of Refugee Youth initiative from the start, and it was well aligned with our priorities. Once the full proposal was submitted, recruitment of the final youth researcher team began. The recruitment process was also aimed to be more participatory than just a set of interviews. Like short listed candidates were invited to a training week where we had more chance to engage with the research team, and they could provide some initial training about the research to increase our understanding of the role. The process for deciding on fair rates of pay involved refugees as well, as we were consulted during the scoping visits and during the project to ensure that the rates were fair and agreed in advance of activities. And towards the end of initiative, the youth researchers were surveyed, in which 86% of us felt that the recruitment process was very fair. In my perspective, I appreciated that it was transparent and we were treated really professionally. Our participation in the remainder of the study was further supported by the Voices of Refugee Youth training program, which Becky is going to reflect on next.
Thanks, Rosina. As mentioned, the training program was a core component of the Voices of Refugee Youth initiatives, which, as Kat said, we delivered in collaboration with John Carroll University and Centraity. Ultimately, its goal was to facilitate the youth researchers' participation in the research, to provide each team member with the skills needed to engage in the research, while also giving them the opportunity to earn an accredited graduate level certificate. Again, there's lots more detail on this in the participatory toolkit, in the research report, and on our new website. But in brief, there are 3 areas of the training programme which we identified as really helpful facilitating factors that helped with enable participation throughout the research study. First, considering the delivery mode, this adapted over the course of the training due to the onset of COVID-19, but we eventually settled on a blended approach with a week of online asynchronous learning prior to a week of in-person training, which provided an opportunity for in-depth reflection and practical application of new knowledge. Second, and linked to this, we found that a pedagogical approach which was practical, task-based and student-centred was most useful, especially so that the training programme could directly link with the realities of participating in the research study, rather than being an abstract theory-based course. And finally, it was key to the design of the Voices of Refugee Youth initiative that the training programme provided a form of accreditation for the youth researchers. This underpins another of the initiative's objectives, as Catherine mentioned earlier, to support young refugees' employment opportunities, as well as their direct participation in the research study. There's much more to reflect on here, but for now, we'll move on to the tool design and data collection phases, passing back to Rosina.
Thanks, Becky. So during data collection, we, the youth researchers team, provided feedback on the survey, interviews, and focus group discussion so that they could be relevant to this context. And then during the data collection, we led on identifying eligible participants according to the sample criteria and conducted all of the surveys, interviews, and focus groups in Pakistan and Rwanda, communicating amongst the team to coordinate this process. This all required us to carefully navigate what it meant to conduct research with our peers. We had many conversations during the training process about ethical implications of being objective during data collection, that is, not using our pre-existing knowledge to make assumptions about how our participants would answer or unintentionally asking any leading questions. And the training helped us to have a critical mindset and reflect on our own positionality, which really mitigated this. Some youth researchers also had to navigate challenges related to our age, position, and our position in our societies. For example, managing situations when school and university authorities didn't allow us to conduct the data collection, so we had to provide them letters of permissions to move forward. But however, being peer researchers meant that we were able to use our context, age, and language knowledge to establish trust with the research participants, helping them to feel more relaxed and open during the surveys, interviews, and focus groups. And one example of this was in my context in Pakistan, where I felt I was able to create safe spaces to speak with other female refugees in our community. So data collection was there for one of the points at which we as youth researchers were able to move beyond being consulted to facilitating and coordinating the research amongst ourselves. Now I'll move back to Becky to reflect on the final stages of the research study.
Thank you. So the stages of analysis and presenting findings really helps us to reflect on what different forms of participation look like, particularly aware that analysis is a key stage to ensure meaningful participation, being that point at which meaning making takes place. But obviously recognizing the challenges of conducting analysis with over 30 researchers, especially in a large-scale quantitative panel study. The same was true of writing up the finding, how to ensure participation of all researchers while producing objective, cohesive research reports. So going through this process highlighted to us the importance of broadening our conceptualization of authorship beyond just written contribution. We found that creating space for vocal input, such as workshops, was a really great way to ensure that multiple voices were feeding into the analytical process or creation of output, and crucially treating that as the same level of authorship as those tasked with writing the end product. Also producing a range of different research outputs, not just the research report in an academic journal, but the youth researchers co-authored advocacy reports and blogs. And this has all helped us to reconceptualize our understanding of what meaningful participation is. We're aware that there's much we could do differently and perhaps better. We'd really engage with more thoughts on this, if I can see the questions coming in on the Q&A. But for now, I'd love to hand over to Rosina for her final reflection.
Thanks, Becky. So I hope this short presentation has helped to share some useful insights and reflections about the participatory methodology of the Voice of Refugee Youth initiative and can stimulate further discussions. And I want to end with a few thoughts from the perspective of myself and my fellow youth researchers about the value of this study. While conducting this research wasn't always easy, I think the overall approach was incredibly valuable. In particular, I think having the training program was really helpful, as it helped me to feel really prepared to take part in the research study, and the detailed discussions we had about certain scenarios made me feel more confident. And towards the end of the study, the youth researcher team was surveyed, and 79% of the youth researchers said that we would be extremely interested in pursuing a career and in the research sector. And even in my own perspective, this was one of the most valuable outcomes because before Voice of Refugee Youth, I studied computer science, and now I'm a research assistant with Jigsaw. And every day I'm able to reflect on the relevance of the work that I do to my own community and thinking about how to increase education opportunities for young people. Overall, I have really enjoyed being part of the research and think that the participatory approach was valuable both to the research outcomes and for us as youth researchers as well. And I would love to end our presentation with this quote from one of the youth researchers, which I think encapsulates our hope for more research like this in the future. Thank you for listening, and I would like to hand back to Asma to lead us through the rest of the webinar. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Becky and Rosina, for outlining the methodology and for your reflections on the process. I know for me personally, I hugely appreciate the participatory approach and the opportunity to help to shape the study. We really look forward to a time when this is the normal way for research to be done. And now I would like to invite Serenia and Salim to join me. Serenia is an education officer at UNHCR headquarters, leading in the area of data and evidence. She is an experienced mixed method researcher. She has a PhD in development studies and has previously worked with other international organizations, including UNICEF and UNDP. Salim is an education research advisor in FCDO, working since 2020 on the Education Emergencies portfolio and currently managing the Education Research in Emergencies and Protected Crisis Program, ERIC, a research program looking at what works to provide quality education in conflict crisis contexts. Thank you both for joining today. We really appreciate your support and are looking forward to hear your reflections. I'm going to ask each of you the same 3 questions. I'll pose question 1 to both of you first, then we'll take question 2 and then question 3. For the question 1, I would like to come first to you, Serenia, and then to you, Salim. So Serenia, you have heard a lot in the presentations. Please, can you highlight a couple of points that really stand out for you as an important finding and contributions to the sector?
Yeah, thank you so much, Asma. And thank you so much for the presentation. I think there were many important findings, but I will focus on 2. I think, first of all, it's important that poor teaching quality was highlighted as one of the systemic factors that are preventing refugees from thriving in education. We all know the central role that teachers play in the successful acquisition of learning outcomes, yet the evidence base that we have around teachers in forced displacement settings is still quite limited, which points to a gap in knowledge that needs to be addressed. Likewise, we have an issue with the resources dedicated to support teachers that teach, as we all know, in very complex classrooms, often in conditions of overcrowding with multilingual, multicultural students and very little training. As Catherine highlighted in her recommendations, and I would really like to emphasize this, donors need to support to pay for salaries aligned with host country teachers, but also refugee teachers need to be given training opportunities. So that's the first one. And the second, there was mention of the need for holistic and psychosocial support and support to address trauma. And it's also extremely important. We know from the literature that exposure to different forms of violence, including school-based violence, but also community violence, has detrimental impacts on the learning outcomes of students. And to me, the takeaway message should be that if children and adolescents don't feel safe in a classroom, they're not ready for learning. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Serenia. And the same question for you, Salim. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Asma, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate today and discuss with you the findings of the research. I'm sharing my views today in personal capacity, but let me first say really huge congratulations for completing this research in a collaborative way. It takes a lot of goodwill and commitment to do important research across countries, and it takes even more goodwill and commitment to do it in a truly participatory fashion. But leave a lasting sense of pride and achievements, as we can hear from the presentations and the testimonies of all those involved. In response to your question, Asma, I think I'm going to share one reflection on the approach and one reflection on the findings. I think my first reflection on the approach is how remarkable it is to make the observation about how you reconceptualized authorship beyond written contributions. I think this observation recognizes a very important reality that authorship is a function of both the opportunities of the author to access the knowledge and the opportunities of the authors to articulate and contribute to the knowledge base that we as a research community value very, very much. But it also recognizes that we in the research community, we often value certain type of contributions, and I mean here the written contribution over other contributions. And I think this is really important because we know from this research and we know from participatory research methods that knowledge comes in all shapes and forms, and especially the knowledge of the lived experience and the knowledge of the community that is sometimes beyond the individual and the accumulation of experience of a community as a whole. So I think this focus on reconceptualizing authorship beyond written contribution is a very, very important one, and one that merits additional thinking and reflection. And the second reflection is in relation to the findings, and in particular your fourth theme about the perspective of the youth and the importance of post-primary education and how this perspective is influenced by the opportunities they have access to. And I believe drawing attention to this theme is important for two reasons. The first is that we know that more children are and will transition from primary to post-primary and higher education in light of the demographic changes and transitions several countries, including those hosting refugees, will experience in the next few decades. But when we also know that we need to think about access to and quality of post-primary, both in terms of programming and research, we need programming to accommodate the growing needs. Today, we only have 6% of university-aged youth have access to higher education opportunities, but we also need the research to understand what works and how we can ensure inclusive access and meaningful access for this growing number of students. However, the critical question is, if refugee youth perspective of higher education are influenced by opportunities they have access to, which you have highlighted in your findings, then to which extent we have a robust understanding of the learning and post-graduation journey in order for us to say that access alone is going, and assuming we improve equality as Sarana highlighted to, in order to say that we will be able to meaningfully include them in education systems, not only as students, but also as part of the wider economy. Right, so I think there is a bit of work for us there to do as a community, as a research community, in understanding the whole educational journey of students post-graduation in their host communities, as well as for those who choose to return or to move to a third country. Thank you. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Salim. And now I'm going to switch the order for the question too, and I'll come first to you, Salim, and then I'll ask you, Serenia, for your reflections. So, Salim, question number 2, from your broad perspective, what are the connections you see, both thematic and methodological, between this initiative and other related work taking place in the refugee education research?
Thank you. That's a hard one. I think thematically, if you don't mind me starting there, I see a connection and a really interesting and important one with research on the sense of belonging and the role of schools and universities as sites for young people to negotiate and navigate the way belonging is understood and navigated in the host community, as well as in their own community. I think even in challenging conditions where children and youth might face openly exclusionary, if you like, acts, schools and universities seem to continue to play an important side socially and relationally for the students to understand how they negotiate and navigate their sense of belonging in the host communities. So I wonder whether there's a connection here to that larger literature on the sense of belonging for refugee children and youth in their host communities, but also, building on some of the perspective-taking literature and economics in particular, some of the work that's taking place there in terms of the relationship between host communities and refugee children and youth. And I think the second point is on the methodology, and I'd like to pick up here on your third data point, looking at the pathway from university to employment 6 to 9 months after graduation. Of course, recognizing that you needed to complete the work within the timeline you had, but it's worth, I think, reflecting a bit here on what the literature on the transition from university to employment could tell us on the average length it takes graduates to convert, if you like, their education capital to employment opportunities. My assumption, even in the most friendly settings, if you like, where we know the legislations are very favorable of the integrating of refugees, it could take longer than 6 to 9 months. And the data point at which you collected the data. So I wonder if there is a bit there in terms of building on this longitudinal work beyond the 6 to 9 months. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. And Serenia, what are your reflections on the second one?
Yeah, thank you, Asma. I mean, I think thematically, just in general, there has been an increasing interest in conducting research on and about forced displacement. It's an issue that can't be ignored, with the number of forcibly displaced persons surpassing more than 110 million as of 2023. And we know that these are already outdated figures given the current situation. Forced displacement has seen a steady increase and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future, which means that it will continue to be a highly relevant issue to keep exploring so that we can deliver efficient solutions for this population. I think it's also worth mentioning that organizations that would normally not have focused on forced displacement are showing an interest in this area of work. The World Bank, for example, has a specific project that is dedicated to building the evidence on what works in settings of forced displacement. And one of the areas of interest is specifically education. And so there are a couple of non-traditional actors that have ventured into this space, which is really positive for us at UNHCR. Methodologically, I think there's been an increasing understanding in academia and in organizations that conduct research in general, that research that is Western-centric and Western-defined ways of doing research are no longer acceptable if they don't incorporate researchers and or perspectives from the global South. And in this sense, we've seen significant work being done, at least in the academic sector, to fund research that involves collaboration with researchers from this kind of geographical area. But crucially, there's also been, at least in my perspective, a redefinition of what counts as robust research. So can we really claim that research is robust if it has a very narrow framework and it's based on only a particular perspective? The rhetoric on decolonization of research certainly suggests that the answer to this is no. Are findings representative of the population of study if they are not meaningfully including and representing them in the research, not just as participants, but also including these voices in the design of the research itself? Is it ethical to exclude those voices? And can we actually say that research is robust if it is not based on ethical principles? I leave you with those sort of reflections and questions up in the air. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Serenia. And just to keep us on our toes, I'll switch back to Serenia to answer first on this final question, and I'll come back to you, Salim. So Serenia, ensuring that refugees have a prominent role in all aspects of research regarding refugee education is clearly crucial. What is your advice on what needs to happen next to ensure that the sector really achieves a radical and widespread shift in norms and practices?
This is a really hard one, especially because we're using the words radical and widespread shift, right? So as a starting point, I think as with all radical shifts in norms and practices, it takes time to achieve these changes. We also need, at least in my opinion, successful champions, and perhaps champions with a lot of visibility to advocate for the cause and to kind of serve as spokespersons for this type of work. So in this sense, events like this session are really crucial for disseminating the research and for sending the message that this model needs to be replicated and more research of this nature needs to be conducted. We also need to think of ways to communicate findings creatively in a way that we engage, yes, our target audiences, but also generating attention from non-traditional actors who could also serve as champions for these causes. At the organizational level, I think we need to open doors more systematically for refugee researchers to have meaningful opportunities to engage in more of this type of work. Organizations conducting research on forced displacement and education should consider lived experience as an important desirable criterion in their hiring practices. I think this is one concrete recommendation. And I think just in general, there are many things that need to happen to ensure the sector really achieves a radical shift, but these are just some general thoughts that I had. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Serenia. Over to you, Salim. What are your thoughts on this question?
Thank you. I think just building on some of the themes that Sania highlighted, I think we need to continue as a research community, and as have you done, started doing this research, to advance a more nuanced and justice-oriented notion of knowledge production. I think just as the international community has embarked on a journey to deepen and operationalize the idea and the notion of localization in the humanitarian sector. I think we as a research community have a bit of work to do in terms of reorienting the concept of knowledge production to take account of those various forms of knowledge that you've highlighted in some of this research. And I think that, as Serena highlighted, this is a long-term endeavor and collaboration across disciplines and across funders and across partners. No single entity can tackle that alone itself. I think the second is about partnerships, and not only who is part of them, but also how they are run and how resources are used and distributed, and who has access and influence over the decision. So similar to what you've highlighted also in the presentation is how you work and collaborate and ensure that the spirit of collaboration runs across the entire process. I think that is also a very important factor, and I think as a field there are some brilliant examples, but we need to build on those brilliant examples. Thank you.
Thank you both, Serena and Salim. It was really encouraging to hear your reflections and your thoughts about what needs to happen next within the sector. We really look forward to journeying with you both as we work to positively disrupt the sector and see impact for the millions of refugees worldwide. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague David to talk about our plans for what follows the Voice of Refugee Youth. Over to you, David. You're not audible, David. We can't hear you. Let's wait a moment for him to rejoin so he can join us again.
Everyone, can you hear me? Sorry about that. That was a terrible moment for my microphone to stop working. Apologies. Thank you, Asma. I'm glad that I've been the only error on this webinar. Everyone else has been wonderful. So my name's David, and I'm going to close for a few minutes before passing back to Asma by explaining what happens next. As you've heard today, Voices of Refugee Youth has been a real learning journey to see how we can establish more collaborative and participatory approaches to research and evidence building. When we started 4 years ago, we didn't fully appreciate how powerful and transformative the model was going to be. And the success is due to the incredible dedication and tenacity of the team that has been involved. But it's also because the model developed that Rosina and Becky have explained to us is really timely, and it presents a practical route through a set of major connected problems. So we feel like we now have a real opportunity to shape the way the sector moves forward. So it's a great pleasure for us to introduce to you GERE. GERE is Global Evidence for Refugee Education, and it's a new applied research initiative building on all the hard-won lessons that we have learned through Voices of Refugee Youth, with young refugee researchers at the centre, existing to build better evidence and improve decision-making for refugee education. So I'm going to spend the next 3 minutes or so explaining why that matters, what will happen next, and how you can be involved. So as we've heard Amy Parfait and Catherine articulate, the problems are clear, substantial, and interconnected. There remain significant evidence gaps in refugee education. Refugee youth are widespread marginalized from the process. Refugee youth lack access to higher education and the professional development pathways into reliable, meaningful employment. So the thing is that the sector broadly agrees on these problems. The question and challenge has been how to find a workable route through them to address them effectively. And what we have with GERE is a practical, tested approach to actually working to tackle them. So what we have with GERE is the combination of these 4 different elements. Each of these problems are important in their own right, but we believe that we have a model that we are developing together to tackle them in combination, building the evidence base through practical implementation research, providing professional development opportunities, increasing pathways to employment, and through all of it, ensuring that refugees have a central role in the research. That means the sector can engage more meaningfully with them in program and policy decisions. So what happens next? What we feel like with Voices of Refugee Youth and the funding that Dubai Cares kindly provided to make that happen, we have now a prototype or a practical model for how these connected challenges can really be addressed. GERE is the way we can address those challenges at a more significant scale, increase to more countries, and we would hope to engage with 150 plus young refugee researchers, building on the cohort of 31 researchers we have already worked with, and make that training and the pathways to employment more accessible for all. Our hope is that over the next 5 years, GERE will really catalyse this fundamental change in research and evidence building. And we would love your help with that. That is a huge challenge and a sobering one. So how to do that? Over the last year, we've had a load of positive feedback from the donor community, academics, refugee education implementing organisations. Everyone we speak to wants GERE to exist. But the work at the moment is entirely funded by Jigsaw and RE UK. So we want to identify a couple of like-minded organisations to provide the financial support to really drive GERE forward so we can achieve the system level change together. We'd also love all of you to promote and share our work, spread the word, and share your best thinking with us on what the good routes forward are. All the communication channels are here and they'll be shared in the chat as well. So that's your introduction to GERE, Global Evidence for Refugee Education. We're in this for the long haul. We look forward to all that lies ahead, and hopefully we can be on that journey with many of you here. Back to you, Asma.
Thank you, David. That feels like an encouraging and hopeful place to finish today by looking to the future. I want to thank all those who have been involved in presenting today. It's the result of a lot of hard work, and it's great to be able to share the process and the findings with you all. Thank you also to each and everyone who has logged in and listened over the past hour. I trust it has been both informative and inspiring. If you have any questions or would like to follow up, then we would love to hear from you. Please do contact us via the email address on the screen and in the chat. And please do check out the new GERE website, as Dave mentioned, where all the outputs from the Voice of Refugee Youth initiative can be accessed. We wish you all well in your work and look forward to connecting with you in the future. Take care and many thanks.